Good morning, folks. We are on the second round of our budget conversations with some departments, first rounds with others, and we're checking back in this morning with our Chief Axtell of our St. Paul Police Department, following up on some specific questions and just getting a little bit of a deeper dive as we enter the deliberations portion of our budget. This is a budget that is challenging for all the departments and for the council and administration, given that we have established a 0% levy limit that we're working with. So every give includes a take, every take includes a give, and we're working not only to find dollars in the budget, but also external money that might help bridge us from one year to the next. So we're recognize the challenges that we're all facing here today. After the police presentation, we will hear from the city attorney's office. Ms. Olson is with us this morning, and that will be a wrap. We'll try to get our meeting completed by 11:30. Obviously, we have a little give on the end of that, but that's what we'll be targeting for. Just a reminder to council members, and I'm going to do what I say and not what I do. If you have headsets, they are transcribe better for the closed captioning. Mine is acting weird today, so I'm not wearing it. I will keep an eye for presenters. I will keep an eye on my colleagues' hands and see if they have questions at any point, and we'll just interrupt you along the way if stuff comes up. So you can just focus on your presentation, and I'll keep an eye on my crewmates over here, and we'll get through questions that we have. What we've traditionally done is just ask questions along the way rather than save them till the end, just because a lot of times it ends up being more efficient, and believe it or not, to do it that way. So that will be our plan of attack, and we will move forward, welcoming Chief Axtell back to the virtual council chambers. Thank you for being here today.
Council President Brenmo and council members, thank you very much for the opportunity to be back with you today. Talk about our budget and the amazing work of the women and men of the St. Paul Police Department. As I've said before, I understand the incredibly difficult decisions that lie ahead for each of you in regard to the budget challenges our city is facing. And I've also said, regardless of the budget that is adopted, I will do everything in my power to protect the peace and maintain public safety through trusted service with respect. I will begin today by talking about the department's special funds, so we have a clear picture between our funding sources, special funds versus general funds. We have been aggressive on seeking out additional funding in both projects and grants. We do this to ensure that we have the funding to provide the best service to our community. After this, I'll go over the questions that were asked by each of you during the last meeting. I know that I previously responded to most of these questions in writing, but I think it would be helpful to discuss them briefly, as they were all great questions. While doing that, I will provide a brief overview of where our stats are today. There was also a question last time about our investments. I will touch on that as well. As always, there will be a lot of time at the end to discuss anything you want, obviously, throughout the presentation as well. 14% of our 2021 budget spending will be from our special funds, while 86% will be from general funds. In 2020, our special fund sources were higher, around 16%, and general fund was at 84%. Slide 4 is a breakdown of our 2020 special funds. Our impound lot makes up 14%, grants are 24%, and special projects 62%. Next slide, slide 5. Over the next several slides, they're in response to the questions and requests for more information from our last meeting on September 16th. Councilmember Tolbert asked about our budget growth and staffing. I think it's important for everyone to know where our SPPD budget is spent. Our budget has gone up a little over $20 million since 2014. This table breaks down the salary spending versus non-salary spending year by year. During this 7-year period, the majority of these increases have gone towards salary and contracted wages. I will break this down in detail on the next couple of slides.
Chief, could I ask you just to pause 1 second? I'm not sure whose screen is viewing, but if you could move the icon, it's like kind of covering up the table. Thank you. Thank you. That works better. Sorry for the interruption. Just a little.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's important. I want you to see the numbers.
Thank you.
Related on slide 7, related to the $20 million budget growth over the past 7 years, 93% of that increase has gone directly to salary and wages for staff. Our salary growth is just over $19 million, while the non-salary budget increase is just over $1.2 million. As you can imagine, with the department of nearly 800 sworn and civilian members, a 3% COLA raise is significant, $3 to $4 million, just with COLA without adding one extra person to our budget. Like most departments, most of our total budget pays for salary, 89% specifically in the police department, which I have no control over. Some might assume that the city is overpaying their police officers, and I can confidently tell you that that simply isn't true. You may recall, Mayor Carter approved a market increase for police officers in the 2019-2020 contract. This was to help the city remain competitive when seeking new police officer candidates during a time of historic low police officer applicants, not only in St. Paul, but throughout the state and the country, in fact. Moving to slide 8, I will highlight the non-salary growth in the police budget. This non-salary growth over the last 7 years amounts to a little more than $1.2 million. You will see on the right side of the slide, this money resides in the police budget, but does not pay for police department operational needs. There are funds for other important programs. The ECC costs have risen over $866,000 since 2014. The ambassador program of $455,760 didn't exist in our 2014 police budget. And the police department will transfer $98,787 out of our department to pay for non-police positions in the city. When I researched this, the department transferred out $16,657 in 2014. That is an increase of more than $82,000 since then. In reality, the department is actually $24,345 less funding for non-salary spending than it did in 2014. We need to remember that we have taken on several expensive programs that have been absorbed, such as the body-worn camera program, and I'll say more about this soon in the next slides. Slide 9 is meant to help us understand where our non-salary money goes. Council President Brenmoen, you'd asked if we could cut a program or something other than police officers, which was a very legitimate question. This slide shows a total breakdown of this non-salary spending for 2021, according to our budget allocations. This category, general services, supplies, other employee expenses, special police material, are the only non-allocated funds we have, but that doesn't mean they're not reserved for operational needs. I mentioned the body-worn camera program a moment ago. We have $794,000 budgeted in this area to cover all of our technology costs, which include phones, computers, software, body-worn camera program, to name a few. And our body-worn camera costs alone in 2019 were over $1 million. For 2020, they're just over $600,000.
Chief, before you move on, I apologize for any confusion, but I do want to clarify that my question about cuts besides officers really wasn't referring to non-salary spending, but rather when we talk about cuts, the immediate response is there will be less officers on the streets, and my question was really more, are there administrative roles? Are there civilian roles? Are there, it was within the salary bucket, but just if there was I think we react to the idea of loss of street patrol because that's who we interface with, and that's where we hear from our constituents. And I read the police report every morning. I know the level of guns on the street is outrageous and dangerous, and I appreciate that work very much, but it was really less directed towards important technology like body-worn cameras and more towards if there were bodies within the department that, like for example, some of our other departments have put some programs on hold for 1 year with plans to, move it ahead in a certain configuration, but with expectations that we would establish those in a year or so when the budget situation is less dire.
Council President, thank you very much for that clarification. And I understand that it was the people within our budget. I talked earlier about the fact that, and I'll get to it a little bit in some of the future slides here, but as we talk about, all of the work that's done within our department and the community engagement division and others, and you'll see on a chart in a little bit, the bulk of our resources are focused on the front line to ensure that we're able to keep up with our ever-increasing calls for service. So thank you for that clarification. And as you mentioned, we certainly can't cut the body-worn camera program. It's vital to the trust and transparency of our community. However, we don't receive the funding equal to the costs of the program. This forces us to adjust and prefer other money and spending to actual costs of the program. For example, the body-worn camera line item budget is $402,000. Our actual expenses were just over $1 million in 2019 and over $600,000 in 2020. In 2021, the money in our budget that is not tied to salary, contracts, or utilities is just under $500,000, actually $472,646. This money covers special materials, ammunition, office supplies, paper, printing, postage, travel, training expenses, special uniforms and equipment, daily operational costs, and it's used also to cover other unfunded programs. Slide 11 shows more examples of the rising costs where no inflationary adjustments are made. The price of our squad cars are rising, labor costs are rising, technology costs are rising. These are the challenges we face as we continue to operate at 2014 levels for non-salary spending. I'm not complaining. I'm just, I think it's important to point out, sometimes we forget that, a squad car costs more and a computer costs more. And it's a challenge that we're always trying to keep up with. Pivoting to your question about staffing, this chart shows our sworn strength history. The question was posed about staffing and how that has changed over time. This chart shows our sworn employee broken down by year. As you can see, we will have an authorized strength of 5 more officers in 2021 than we did in 2014. This chart on slide 13 shows a simple yet contrasting growth across the city. Since 2014, our 9/11 calls and Part 1 crimes have increased. Our population and number of households has been rising, which we all agree is a great benefit to our city. However, as demands for service continue to rise, our sworn authorized strength personnel remains relatively flat. And where I understand Councilmember Jalali's well-stated point that increasing 9/11 calls does not necessarily mean it's more crime, just more people calling 911. What this does mean is that there's an increased service demands on the police department in addition to the above-mentioned additional police calls and additional reported crime. Outside of the reported crimes, there are more traffic accidents, runaway and missing kids, disputes that turn out to be non-criminal, alarm calls, or other circumstances that require a police response. I know you will all recognize the next slide on 14 as it generates a lot of questions. Its primary purpose is only to show how many employees the police department has working. I appreciate the discussion the council led last year on possibly hiring ahead of the authorized strength to prevent our staffing from getting low, especially during the busiest summer months. Of course.
Chief, if I could just ask you to pause a moment. Ms. Naker has a question.
Thank you. I'm not sure. I didn't mean to interrupt the chief necessarily. It's about this slide and the previous slide. But I guess, Chief, 2 questions. One, I'm looking at the growth in, and I appreciate the information that you provided in the addendum F from the staffing study. My question last time had been about how the number of officers on patrol relates to the number of sworn officers employed. And I know Council President just brought this point up that I think people are hearing numbers of officers being lost and thinking that's numbers of officers on the street not being able to respond to 911 calls, for example. So I looked at the relationship between number of sworn officers and number of officers on patrol based on the information you sent, and it looked like from 2014 to 2019, we had 17 more sworn officers in the department, and we had just 4 more officers actually out on patrol, according to Commander Sareer's study. So I'm wondering, clearly there's a much greater increase in the number of sworn officers we had than patrol officers. I'm wondering then what's the relationship between the number of sworn officers and the number of officers on patrol? It doesn't seem like an increase in sworn necessarily leads to the same number of increase out on the street. And I'm wondering if a decrease then leads to a corollary decrease on the street. And my second question, maybe I'll just hold off on because that was a big question.
Thank you, Councilmember Naker. As we continue to focus on the priorities, and I'll talk a little bit later about how important it is to engage our community at historic levels, as pointed out certainly in the President Barack Obama's 21st century policing task force's trust and transparency has to be at the forefront of what we do. We've adopted the 21st century policing model in our city. So that's one thing. We are focusing, yes, on the street, but also focusing on making sure people have the confidence to pick up that phone and call 911 when they truly need a police officer, when they have that worst day of their lives. Secondly, we have a lot more technology in the department. Technology needs to be monitored. It needs to be managed. It needs to be supervised. Body-worn cameras has been a game changer in the St. Paul Police Department. And what's monitored is managed. Compliance of rules and regulations, making sure we have enough supervisors, holding ourselves to the accountable to the standards that our community and our city leaders and certainly the St. Paul Police Department administration expects each and every day. So it's always a balancing act, and we certainly focus on the backbone of the police department, which is patrol. But they have to be supported, they have to be mentored, they have to be guided to make sure that we're upholding the standards of our community. And, the truth is that we can shrink our department, but all the areas that I talk about with engaging our community at historic levels, those will be the areas that will be diverted to answer the frontline 911 calls. And you'll see that occurring. Chief Arredondo in Minneapolis is talking about that right now as his department continues to shrink the units, and talking with him frequently. He's a dear friend of mine. He is having to cut those engagement activities to keep up with the frontline 9/11 response. So it's always a balancing act. And thank you so much for that, your question and your the recommendation that you're talking about.
Thank you. And Council President, just as a follow-up, and I appreciate the point that it's not just about officers on patrol, that the entire department obviously is working together to prevent and solve crime. But I wanted to ask about that. And just for the record, in case folks aren't delving too deep into Appendix F that we received, in our average number of officers on patrol looks like it's about 250. So, this graph showing the 582 and then the 549 in the end of 2021, the average number of officers actually out on the street is about half of that. I just think it's important to kind of paint that picture. And then my second question was looking at the attrition in 2020. I know, Chief, you had talked to us previously. We've been talking about the attrition projected in 2021 that won't be able to be filled. Can you talk about, looking at this slide, it looks like in this year, 2020, we're expecting to have 25 fewer officers at the end of the year than we did at the beginning of the year based on attrition. Is it the case that generally we, in normal years, we're not able to fill all of the seats that we lose due to attrition, or is that just going to be the case for the first time this coming year with the mayor's proposal?
We always have an academy when we have enough money in the bank to have the academy, and the way the budget's set up, we have to wait for the attrition number, enough officers to leave in order to be able to afford an academy. So that's sometimes a little confusing. Right now, this year, we've had 19 separations so far, and we expect up to 14 more by the end of the year. But if I can, just real quickly, Councilmember Naker, get back to the question, the stat you gave on officers on patrol. That's a little confusing to people because that doesn't include officers in our ACOP unit who are officers on patrol. It doesn't include our canine officers who are officers on patrol. So there may be a little clarification that's needed on the number of officers in uniform, in a squad car, out interacting and serving our community. And many others, and certainly take calls. And as the crimes go up, the investigations go up, et cetera. So we need more investigators to investigate those crimes.
Okay, no, that's helpful. And I was just looking at the page 39 of the staff report in the appendix. So it's helpful to know that that doesn't include all the staff on patrol, and maybe we could get the full numbers. But just really quickly, Council President, to the point then about attrition. So in this year, in a given year, we do see numbers drop by attrition that we are not able to fill in that given year.
Yes, Councilmember Naker, that's true, and so that's been my ask for throughout the years, is to be able to hire enough officers over the authorized strength, knowing that we have at least 2 officers leave every month throughout our history, and it's our projections are more over this year and next year. Actually, we've had several that have shown intentions to leave on medical retirements and other issues that are coming up. So if we're able to hire above our sworn strength so that we, during this busy summer months, we have our actual sworn strength available to answer the calls during the busiest month of the year, I think is something good to look forward to in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we're back on slide 14. We talked about the attrition getting during our busiest months of the summer. Of course, that's not a discussion this year without a 2020 academy. And if we don't have an academy until late next year, if at all, this is a conservative estimate of where the police staffing will be. This highlights that we will have at least 35 fewer officers next year than we did this year at the same time. With our increasing service demands, the number of social demonstrations that require staffing to keep everyone safe, the COVID-19 pandemic, and other factors, I'm concerned about this staffing projection. We are currently at 618 officers, with up to 14 more identified as potential leaving before 1/1/2021. We've had 19 separations so far this year, as I mentioned earlier. 7 officers have also shared their intent to leave in early 2021. As a reminder, the orange bar across the top shows our authorized strength. The light blue bar shows real-time numbers, month by month, of how many officers we have on the payroll, how many are on staff. The dark blue bar shows the actual deployable number. The difference between the 2 blue bars, as I've shared before, is the margin of those on extended leave, military leave, injured, or other reasons, such as the birth of a child. Slide 15 is a new depiction of our department by division. Councilmember Naker had asked about who is actually on the street, as we just discussed. As you can see, the patrol division is the backbone of our agency and is the primary core service. Crime and call response, as well as investigations, are services we must provide and continue to provide. The staffing numbers around each division highlight how many sworn or civilian staff are within that division. These numbers represent the department authorized strength, and of course, we do not necessarily have that number today, and this changes almost daily. I've been asked about what we would cut if we reduced the department. Slide 16 shows the forecasted impacts to leaving positions open. There's not an exact model that I can put in front of you because I have to constantly adjust resources responding to the trends we are experiencing. As people leave our department, we will continue to focus our resources on core services and patrol response. But this is not without potential drastic impacts, especially to our community engagement division. Since 2016, I've worked hard, and we've all worked hard to balance your police department to be far more than a reactive criminal enforcement model. We have worked to integrate engagement and trust as a key service delivery priority. The police departments throughout the country are working to build what we have here in St. Paul, and I'm concerned that we could turn back the clock. As our numbers go down, we're forced to redeploy. This will potentially translate to our community engagement division being fully reallocated back to patrol and investigations so we can provide the core services necessary for the city. This is the last thing I think any of us wants, and it should be the last thing that we look at. But as I mentioned earlier, and as you know, we're following the President Barack Obama 21st century policing guidelines where engagement and trust are critical to the legitimacy of a police department.
Chief,
yes, ma'am.
Chief, just I appreciate that breakout, and I think we've seen similar conversation from other departments. I haven't thought this through enough to speak very eloquently about it, but I do think that ideally we do not want to have a community engagement division. I think in an ideal world, community engagement is just what we do. It's part of all of our policing and not a standalone special division. So I guess I would push back a little bit on this thought that it's something that is a standalone and needs to be treated separately. And when we think about Coast or even just some of the other pieces of community engagement, I look forward to a time when that is just integrated into our police department and not a standalone division.
Thank you very much, Council President. I appreciate the observations. My concern with that is when you have a frontline police service response model that is simply going call to call to call without time to get out of their squad cars, engage residents, engage business owners, build meaningful relationships. What happens, as we've seen throughout the history of time, is you turn into an occupying force. And so engagement of the community is very important. Yes, it should be done at the patrol level. It is done at the patrol level extensively. But the busier our officers get on the front line, the less time they have to get out of their squad cars and build those meaningful relationships.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and that's definitely true as well. I think what I'm saying is certainly not in conflict with that. I want to make sure that that there's time for both. So I appreciate that perspective as well, and it does bring it into focus. And I guess I'm just reacting a little bit to like the last thing we want to do is lose this division. And I thought actually, ideally, we shouldn't have to have it, but I think that that's an aspirational goal and something that we're working towards. And I do appreciate the point about when our officers are going to call and just simply reacting. That's not an ideal situation either.
Thank you, Council President. I appreciate that. And then slide 18 as well speak to Councilmember Jalali's point about conflating 911 and crime levels. I want to share a little bit about where we are with crime levels. Unfortunately, violent crime in our city continues to rise. The Part 1 crimes are up. Homicides are tragically high for a second year in a row. Robberies, shootings, shots fired calls, they're all rising at alarming rates. Our community is well aware that the victims of these crimes remain disproportionately people of color and predominantly from areas of concentrated poverty. And coincidentally, our 9/11 calls are rising too. Slide 19 is the further data here. It's not just person crimes, but also property crimes that are rising. Reported crimes are also increasing at a higher rate than the 911 calls. Slide 20 is the slide that really keeps me up at night. I know it keeps us all up at night, and rightfully so. These trends are concerning. The rise of shots fired and people hit by gunfire in our city are unacceptable. As of today, we have just within the last week, we broke our all-time record of people injured by gunfire, and we still have quite a bit of time left to go in 2020. The rise in shots fired and people hit are unacceptable. I have redeployed our resources to combat this historical challenge and recently closed the force unit, reassigning those officers to focus on gun violence. I believe there are several causal factors, certainly, that many are out of the hands of the police department. But we continue to do all that we can to prevent our kids from pulling triggers, taking guns off streets, and presenting thorough cases for prosecution. Slide
Chief,
21.
Chief,
Yes, ma'am.
before you move on, I think back a slide or so, Ms. Naker had a follow-up.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you, Chief. It is beyond alarming to see the statistics on this slide, but of course, we're also seeing them in our neighborhoods, and I really am grateful to the work that your officers are doing to try to stem this alarming increase in shots fired and in homicides that I know we've all been seeing. I've seen very close to home very recently, and I appreciate all that you're doing on that. But I want to go back to the point that you made a couple of slides ago and the question that was asked by Councilmember Jalali at our last meeting, which I thought was a very salient point about the connection between the officers that we have on our force and the amount of crime in the city. And I noticed the point that crimes have been going up steadily since 2014, 2012, and so have the number of officers, right? We've been increasing our staffing over that time, and we've seen crime go up over that time. And I did think that the response, while generally the responses to our follow-up questions that you provided were really helpful and thorough, I thought that the response to that question was lacking because it sort of talked about increases in crime that we've seen and increases in officers that we've seen, rather than pointing to a direct connection between, do the number of officers that we have employed actually mean that we see an effect on crime? It seems like from this data we don't. So I'm curious if there's maybe more that you want to share about that, or other resources we can look to actually pinpoint the connection between number of officers and number of crimes.
Thanks. Thank you, Councilmember Naker. Appreciate that. Yes, as you talk about the increasing crimes in the graph from 2014 to 2020, you'll see we have 5 more officers, and certainly the population has grown exponentially. The businesses, the soccer stadium, the great things occurring in St. Paul are driving up a demand for service. So there's a lot of other factors that go into this, but when we look at adequate staffing, I think slide 21 will maybe get to some of the point of what we're talking about. Is where we invest when we have adequate staffing. An example is our sexual violence unit has been a top priority for us. We keep this unit fully staffed and attempted to reduce the workload so investigators can take every single victim as a priority. Year to date, our sexual assaults are down 13% and represent only one of 2 areas in our department where crimes are less than last year. Now, certainly I know that simply more police officers doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to reduce crime. What I'm saying is that the victims of crime in our community, people who hear a gunshot in their alley, people who have been a victim of a crime, when they pick up the phone to call a police officer to respond to them during the worst moment of their lives, I think we ought to have enough police officers available to answer those calls in a timely manner, because that builds trust, that builds confidence. And so there's a lot that goes into the question and issue that you bring up. And I know that there's a lot on the front end that, the mayor's great work with Community First Public Safety and trying to prevent crimes before they happen. But unfortunately, we still have crimes occurring now. And we have to deal with those crimes in a timely manner and investigate and follow up to support victims of crime. And so we're committed to continuing to do that. We have also made our homicide unit a top priority, keeping the unit fully staffed despite our attrition. We've added personnel to reduce workloads, which is paying off huge dividends. Our clearance rates are remarkably above the national averages, especially looking at cities of our size. As of last week, our 2020 homicide clearance rate for the St. Paul Police Department was 88%, 22 of 25 charged, and I expect that to increase even with our 2 recent tragic homicides over this last week. I'd also like to touch on the partnership with the public housing on slide 22.
Chief, I'm sorry, before you move on to the partnerships with public housing, Ms. Princess had her hand up for a bit. I missed that. And I also see Ms. Jalali has her hand up. So let's pause for some questions from Councilmember Prince and then Councilmember Jalali.
Yes, ma'am.
Ms. Prince, you may be on mute.
Chief, I'm sorry to interrupt the narrative here, but I've had my hand up. Apparently there was some issue with being able to see where I was on the screen. But in any event, I want to take us back to the community engagement discussion and you don't have to go back to the slide, but also the attrition issue. What I want to say about community engagement and so much of what we're talking about here is this is what makes the St. Paul Police Department the St. Paul Police Department. That these are the things that when Mayor Carter went on national television after the tragic murder of George Floyd, he was able to talk about the emphasis that we in St. Paul put on community engagement, on the Coast Unit, on the innovations, the 21st century policing that we do it in St. Paul. So I recognize that we have serious budget problems this year. At the same time, we're having really serious crime problems. So then that takes me back to the attrition slide, which since last year's budget, I find it completely unacceptable that we are dropping to the numbers that we could potentially drop to. It looks like about 40 officers by the end of next year without an academy. This is completely unacceptable to me that our numbers are dropping like this, because what we're also doing, as we know when we talk to the fire department about physical and mental health issues, the stress that is on our officers at this time, like every police officer in the United States, is deeply concerning. The attrition numbers are apt to be worse than we can even anticipate because of the stress and pressure, because of the pressure caused by guns on the street. So what I want to take us back to is I have gotten information about the LECPA, the Law Enforcement Career Path Academy, which is a function of both our community engagement work, but also our efforts to diversify our department. And I have been told that all of the LECPA students that might be eligible to be in an academy are no longer available to us, that they have all moved on to other jobs, to other municipalities. And I understand from talking to you yesterday that this is not the case. And I don't know whether you want to talk about it now or you want to wait till further in the presentation, but I think it's critical that we have a police academy, if only to bring those LECPA, it would be an entirely diverse class that could come on of people who have been trained through our community engagement unit. I think it's critical that we talk about that. It would be a small academy, but it would be exactly the kind of police officers that are the future, that we want to be the future of our department. So you can choose to present that now or later in the presentation, but it is unacceptable to me that we are considering allowing attrition to grow to this extent, and that we are thinking that community engagement is something that can be handled by every cop as they're doing their job.
Thank you, Councilmember Prince. Yeah, we have actually 9 of, as you know, the LECPA program We started that back up in 2016, 2017 at no cost to the city. We had the first group of approximately 10 officers that were eligible for our 2019 academy. They're hired, they're thriving in our community. They are doing an incredible job. And we've lost a few to other departments, but we still have approximately 9 LECPA students and another 4 LECPA similar students, the parking enforcement officers, the community liaison officers, totaling about 13, all 100% diverse from our communities that are ready to go if in fact we were able to hire. So that's the fact.
Is it feasible to put together an academy that would include that diverse class? Can we look at those numbers and consider that?
Absolutely. If we could have our training staff pull together an academy within a matter of weeks, certainly we have to go through extensive backgrounds and whatnot, but we certainly could.
So just to clarify, is there a minimum number of recruits that you would need to run an academy?
No.
And then the cost of running an academy, of course, is de minimis versus the tail of the hiring of those officers. And I think that those are the two things that come together. If we were able to, I mean, as you know, I'm a supporter of the LECPA troop too. And I thought my information was just that it's a 3-year program and that there was a class that graduated in August. There's remaining kids that young adults that are in the program right now. So I don't think I wasn't under the impression that everybody was scattered to the winds. It's just that it was that they had graduated in August and that the academy didn't happen, so they couldn't go forward into the academy. I'd be interested in looking at along with Ms. Prince at what that would look like. But I also do want to make sure that we're clear that if we have an academy and we hire more officers, then there is a tail and a cost to that we will need to make room for in the 2021 budget. And I'm saying that as I'm not for it or against it. I'm just making clear that there's a cost attached to that beyond just an academy.
Yeah, thank you, Council President, Council Member. Yes, so that's it's an important distinction, and I couldn't be more proud of our LECPA students. And as a matter of fact, in talking with a couple of our young female cadets that have told me that they are committed to waiting for St. Paul to be ready to hire them. And that speaks to the character of some of our students, that they truly believe in our city. And I'm just, it's just heartening to hear that.
But to clarify, there's no minimum number. If there was 3, you could do an academy?
Yeah, we've done an academy with 5 people before.
Okay. And Ms. Prince, did you have a follow-up on the same question, or should I move to Ms. Jalali?
Yeah, yes, I had a follow-up.
Okay.
And to that point of the tails and how we pay for it in 2021, and this is where I just don't have a good handle on this aspect of budgeting. But it seems to me, if we are losing a number of officers through attrition, that we would be able to absorb new officers coming on. If we're losing, there may be something I'm not getting there, but it just seems to me that they would fill those positions that are being vacated.
So as far as the cost goes, if we put on the 1,300% diverse young people, for an example, for the rest of the year, just doing some rough math here, that'd be about $120,000 by the time we could get an academy started. And then 2021 to keep those 13 on. And we don't always keep the 13. We lose a couple to whatever the family issues or other things, they leave the department. But if all 13 remained, it would be approximately $1.2 million in 2021, but it's also important then to understand that the salary attrition that we have to meet in 2021 is $3.7 million. So we need to save $3.7 million in 2021 before we can hire one person. And that is a couple million more than we have had to absorb in the past. So it's really a dire financial outlook for us.
Thank you. And it's definitely something that we will follow up on. Ms. Jalali.
Thanks. I'm kind of not sure where to start because I also had my hand up for three to six things ago. But I guess to kind of add in what this is making me think about, I appreciate Council President Bren Moen's point about our community engagement philosophy within the police department a lot. I'm certainly hearing that it's important that we make sure we have a trusted police force. I also think that it is important to integrate that as an ethos. And there's kind of two things that I'm hearing that prevent the police department from doing that. One is just the volume of calls and being able to respond to those, which I'll set up a question about response and kind of a new direction forward in a minute. And then the second is just like we have it sidelined into its own little unit. And that's in part response to the first thing. I guess I'll just say I hear all the time from our community who are not in law enforcement and who are seeing the full scope of what our, especially Black and Indigenous and other communities of color are dealing with, that the community doesn't get hired to engage the community ever. Like we'll pay the police to do that, or we'll pay random white nonprofits to do that, or other groups of people to do that. But we don't actually hire like our most impacted residents to drive conversations about what would make their lives better. And so I've been trying to hold that frame because I think it's important, and we can't just outsource the engagement. We also can't not integrate it. It's a complicated question. So I'm more just saying that to offer. I mean, I think that it is important to be willing to have a vision for community engagement within and beyond SPPD that centers things differently than it has in the past, in my opinion. And the second question then about what would it really take to just like make these numbers change, to change these sickening statistics, to get out of the cycle of, I feel like it's just constantly a battle every year with, is crime going down? Is our staffing level right? What about all these different sub-initiatives? And I mean, ultimately, we want violence to go down in our city. We want there to be police that don't suffer from mental health issues because they're overworked and because of they're getting sent to the trauma that our communities are living firsthand. And I guess I'm curious, Chief Axtell, what your reaction would be to the idea of a future public safety model for our community where police aren't the only responders and a significant proportion of calls right now for mental health and medical emergencies go to non-police entities who can go out and respond to things. And in addition, that we just have better systems for what so many 911 calls are. Like, I know that sometimes it's just Facebook and you just see things on the internet, but I literally saw constituents posting yesterday about like a random bucket in the yard and that they called the non-emergency number and were expecting police to come out and like make sure about what's in the bucket. Like people call 911 and or affiliated systems in our city for anything and everything. And I often hear the police department tell them to do that and then turn around and say that there's too many calls into 911. And I want to get us out of that cycle and actually like compartmentalize what we're supposed to be dealing with. So do you envision a future for our city where we have an expanded public safety model that is actually shifting investments and, I am asking like shifting investments out of SPPD and into a more expanded force so that every group within the strategy is able to focus on their efforts? Like, what would your reaction be to a vision like that, I guess, is something I'm curious about.
Councilmember Jalali, thank you very much. I think the vision for the future is actually occurring now. A few things come to mind. We've worked very closely with our communication center, the Ramsey County ECC, to make sure some of the calls, like you just explained, a bucket in the yard, we won't send a squad to that call. we've worked closely with the ECC to let them know what our expectations are and when a police officer is really needed. We've also worked very closely with the St. Paul Fire Department on medical issues. In the past, our officers were called more to somebody who appeared maybe to be in distress of a medical issue, when that is truly a fire department medic response. So we have trimmed down many of those calls. As far as the investments with Mayor Carter's Community First Public Safety initiatives, with the ambassadors that are out there working in our community, connecting with kids, trying to keep people out of the criminal justice system. In addition to, we have a work group internally within our department right now, led by Deputy Chief Matt Topol, researching every police call that we go to in partnership with our community partners out there on, are there calls that simply shouldn't be handled by other people, but just simply shouldn't be a police response. So we're studying that right now. I know Mayor Carter is also engaged with many community and business members about other alternative responses to some of those 9/11 calls. And I certainly am looking forward to those conversations. And if there are opportunities where other resources can take some of the calls that we're traditionally taking now in a way that maintains public safety in our city, I am all for engaging in those conversations. And we look at the other things that we've created, the COAST unit, which is police officers co-responding to mental illness issues that are police related with a mental health professional. These are things, again, that other departments throughout the country are trying to replicate as we speak during some very challenging budget times. So I believe in St. Paul are ahead of the curve. We don't have it figured out. We certainly aren't the best of the best. I don't pretend to say that I'm the smartest chief in the world, but I certainly need all of our community members and our business community and our elected officials to stay engaged in those conversations so that we can continue to improve.
Thank you, Chief.
Thank you. So moving on then to slide 22, as I mentioned earlier about our partnership with public housing. Back in 1992, the end of Chief McCutcheon's term, into the Chief Finney's term, we created, in partnership with PHA, the ACOP unit, which has really been a model throughout the country. And you look at the results of those investments, having dedicated officers to build relationships, have time to build relationships, and in addition to responding to the 911 calls in these areas. The partnership and collaboration as designate officers and staff to these properties throughout PHA has shown noteworthy gains. For all of 2019, there were only 212 Part 1 crimes reported at PHA properties. The calls for police service to PHA properties were substantially lower per 100 residents than the average of the city as a whole. Our direct investment in this area in partnership with PHA has made the community safer and has helped us build trusting relationships in these areas.
Chief,
yes,
Chief, on those PHA numbers, there you don't have the on other slides. I've noticed you're using 2020 data and then pegging it to 2019 year to date. And this one, I don't see 2020 data, and I'm curious if we have that.
Yeah, it's not complete, so we didn't add it. But as soon as we get it complete, or if we can, I'm sitting next to one of my staff members right now. We'll look at year to date to see if we can get some updated numbers, and we'll share that with the entire council if we can pull that together.
I'd appreciate that. It's just it's one of the challenges that I realize that we can just get so bogged down in data and numbers, but one of the challenges that I have when we go through the report is I'm just trying to get a perspective and put things really into perspective. And so it does feel like we switch how we're presenting the data from one section to the next. So any way that we can be consistent about if we're talking about crime in 2020 and pegging it to 2019, then I think we should do that through all of the slides. And it was complete enough to use in the slides behind us. And the reason why I'm asking particularly on this is I agree. Historically, the public housing we have a very large public housing unit in Ward 5 and have had virtually no police calls. And this year we have actually seen police calls there. So I'd be very interested in hearing what's going on in 2020. But again, consistency between the different from slide to slide would be helpful in understanding where we're at.
Thank you, Council President. The difference in this is some of the data we're dealing with isn't just from our data sources, but also PHA. But we'll pull together what we can, and thank you for your observations on that.
Great. I do see Ms. Yang has a hand up.
Thank you. I just have a question on this slide because I do remember getting a PowerPoint or seeing a presentation from PHA about this, and I don't remember. Can you remind me if the police officers who respond to like PHA properties, are they only delegated to serve PHA properties, or do they also like respond to other calls across the city too?
Councilmember Yang, thank you very much for your question. Predominantly, they respond to PHA properties. They're paid for by PHA. There are some circumstances when high priority calls come out in their area close to where they are, where they will divert and help from time to time. And we have that in the contract where they're allowed to do that. So, but predominantly they are focused on our public housing agency locations.
Got it. And just a follow-up, all of the police officers serving the PHA properties and like all of their wages do come from, are paid for by PHA? Is that
Yes,
what
ma'am.
I'm hearing from you?
Yes, ma'am. That's correct.
Okay,
That's
thank you.
Yep. Thank you. So I'm on, I think, the last slide here. As I said earlier, we're not just a reactive law enforcement focused department. I can highlight dozens of our successes, the LACPA, Coast, PAL, Bike Truck, community engagement as a whole. We're making a difference with chemical dependency, mental illness, homelessness, and other challenging areas. And speaking of homelessness, certainly Deputy Mayor Tincher and Director Cervantes have done an incredible job with addressing that critical need in our community. I again share my open invitation for you all to visit our programs, ride along with our officers, join us at roll calls, visit our community events. These relationships didn't happen just overnight. We have been committed to making regular deposits into our bank of trust every day without exceptions. And I just want to thank you all for your time and allowing me to be with you today. And I'll see if I can get my camera figured out now.
And Chief, I want to second that invitation that you just made. And I've mentioned several times that I had the opportunity to take the Civilian Police Academy and found it incredibly informative. I was talking to some officers just a week or so open market at my last ride along, and they're like, when's the last time you took a ride along? And I'm like, well, it's been 4 years. And they were like, well, you should do it again because things have really changed in the past, few years, but also particularly since COVID, and thought it would be helpful to go back out and do a ride along. And so I'm going to follow or take them up on that offer. I think it's helpful to understand better when you've spent some time in other folks' shoes. And I encourage my colleagues to do the same. I think it's very helpful and informative. There are certain things that I didn't know that I thought were fantastic, certain things I didn't understand, and I had a chance to ask a question. And it's just interesting to see things from a different perspective. So I second that and encourage people. We're busy and it's COVID, but I really think it's helpful to take that time in that one-on-one setting to really see what happens out on the streets. I'm looking to my colleagues to see if there's other questions. We peppered you a lot in the middle of the presentation, so I don't know if we're questioned out at this point. Definitely heard some follow-up and some priorities coming from my colleagues based on questions. So I do not see, I see Mr. Tolbert has a hand up, so let's go to Councilmember Tolbert.
Yeah, first of all, Chief, thank you for the thorough follow-up. It was really helpful so we can get a better picture of how the department spending is allocated and why some of the challenges are faced. The one thing, and I actually probably this isn't the police department that would collect this number, so maybe it's a thing for Holly to follow up with the dispatch committee, but looking at those rising 911 calls, especially as a matrix, I was thinking about it. I'm a frequent caller because I follow the advice of, the first commander that I was, Councilmember under Commander Axtell, now Chief Axtell, and then now Commander Anderson, of what we tell neighbors at every meeting. If you see something, make a call or something like that. And I do that, and I do it more frequently now because I have my cell phone in my pocket at all times. So it's a lot simpler than back in the old days when, some people here probably don't predate cell phones, but back when we had to get home and remember to make the call about something that we saw 4 blocks away on our walk. But the thing that I'm kind of curious about is the types of calls that we're getting. And I think maybe if 911 dispatch could put together those numbers just so we can have that data, I think would be really helpful to see how those calls break down, whether it's, a neighbor saying, I saw someone walk in my boulevard, or, didn't pick up their dog poop, or whatever that might be, or if it's the more serious calls. And I think a breakdown of that would be really helpful as we go forward, to see the different types of calls that we're having. And I don't know how hard that is to pull together. And but just want to put that out there if we can follow up with Ramsey County Dispatch or whoever would be the right authority to ask.
Councilmember Tolbert, thank you very much. Actually, we can get that data for you and share it with the entire council. One of the I think things that we talk about that I hear sometimes from folks throughout community and our elected officials is that the priority 4, priority 5, the lower priority calls are increasing, and with the assumption that the lower priority calls aren't as important. But it's important for us to know that, for example, a priority 4 call oftentimes will be an aggravated assault where no suspect is present. They want a report made because they've been assaulted. It could be a window peeper that happens to not be out their window at that very given moment. But if you're a victim of a window peeping incident, it's very critical that we have somebody that can respond. When people call 911, I had this happen not that long ago in my alley in St. Paul, where somebody saw somebody 2 a.m. walking down the alley. I don't know if I should call the police or not, because it looked a bit suspicious and out of the ordinary. And lo and behold, the next day there were 3 cars that were broken into in garages and items taken. So we encourage people to call. The calls are then prioritized by the Emergency Communications Center based on in-progress crimes or what can wait, we can send a squad to when the resources are in line with that. So we do want the calls and let the professionals decide how soon that we can get there and how we prioritize those calls. But I just don't want people to believe that a priority 4 call isn't important to a crime victim in our city.
Right, thank you for that. All right, it looks like we have we're out of questions at the moment. There will be follow-up. We have obviously a couple of months here to go before we set the final levy, but we do very much appreciate your work, your leadership, the work of the force every day, all day. So thank you for being here, and be safe out there. Keep those masks on. We hear there's we're reading that there's a little bit of an outbreak, so be careful.
Yeah, we've had quite a few people that have become sick, and you're looking at one of them that has become sick but has since recovered. So it's a challenging time, but I just want to leave it at this with each of you, that I know that you all have incredibly difficult jobs to do, unwinnable decisions that you have to make. No matter what you decide, it's difficult. And as a resident of the city, I appreciate your leadership throughout our entire city.
Thank you, Chief. We appreciate that. We are going to shift over now to City Attorney Lindsay Olson. So thank you very much, Chief. Ms. Olson, the floor is yours for the City Attorney's Office budget.
Good morning, Council President Bremlin, council members.
Morning.
Holly's going to help me with the slides here, so I'll wait for her to load that up.
I'm looking at it.
All right. So next slide. Here's our adopted budget. We had a target reduction of $647,464. and most of that was met. We had a significant salary savings into between 2020 and 2021 that were from retiring folks in the office, and then we've left an OA2, an office assistant 2, vacated for this year that we're hoping to fill in 2021, going through the exception process. And we also cut down on law clerks throughout the office, not replacing those that we had previously on the books. We were able to have a litigation cost savings in 2020 in part because we had the court shut down for a period of time, and that resulted in less work for a period in litigation. And we also have been very successful in litigation division in dispositive motions. So in motions before a case gets started. So we have a very high success rate in those motions, and that has also cut down in our ongoing court costs. The other thing that we did for 2020 was move a portion of a PED attorney that had been previously paid for out of the general fund into the special fund, working through HRA and PED to do that. Next slide. So we've had an uptick in our work just throughout the office. We moved to a primarily remote workforce. So over 70% of our CAO staff has been able to work remotely. It was a higher percentage while the courts were closed from March to I think sometime in July. And now we have a rotation that comes in the criminal department to do cases. Most cases are done, most hearings are still done remotely, but we have people in the office rotating in when they have court appearances to make so they can prepare. We have a baseline of office staff that assists in the office, particularly in the criminal division, because of the law enforcement sensitive databases that we have, and we can't, it's difficult for us to have those folks working remotely. We've also had to cancel trainings and step back on some of our best practice work and and the implementation of our new management system because of the remote work. It's been more difficult to continue to move forward on those pieces. Next slide. And so to continue our COVID-19 impacts, I mentioned the temporary closing. Our ethos program was also on hold, in part because we were not receiving cases in from the courts, but we also have a backlog of referrals that we had put into the bucket to bring into the ethos program that we weren't able to move forward with because everything was shut down. We've now been able to ramp that back up just within the last month. The civil division has also had a significant increase in work due to the states of emergency that have been declared over the past year, primarily in tracking, drafting of declarations, executive orders, issues with ongoing open meeting law, as well as looking at ways to implement large programs that we've done in the city, such as Bridge Fund, things like that, that have come up, CARES Act funding, review, a lot of those types of things that were unanticipated and brand new. So really a lot of innovative work and analysis being done by the civil division to move through these problems, not just to create a legal basis, but to do so on a very constrained time frame in order to make sure that we're serving people appropriately in these emergency times and to take advantage of the funding periods that are available. So I have a lot of attorneys working a lot of really long weeks to make those things happen. Next slide. As far as our civil unrest, we've had significant hours in both the civil and litigation as well as criminal. You can see the criminal division hours are significantly higher there, and that's because of both in looking at civil unrest issues with the police department, working all kinds of hours as far as advising to the police department and other departments when these emergencies arise. And they have several times when we had the huge state of emergency that occurred in May, but as many of you probably know, we continue to have different types of protests all over the city at a fairly regular rate, and issues surrounding those happen from time to time. And that's just something, hearing what, our police department is doing. I know firsthand, working with them through the civil unrest issues, that the way that the police department is looking at these and working with my office and working through an analysis of how to protect protesters, how to engage with the community, and how to keep people safe. It's, we work through that every single time, and it's been very successful. I think we've had no issues as far as mass arrests and violence, and so I think that partnership has gone very well. Next slide. So as far as cost containment strategies, we were asked for reductions. Those came primarily from salary savings, as I mentioned. We had and continue to try to gain significant salary savings when we have retirements, because we're looking to diversify our office, have our office look more like the communities that we serve, bring in new talent, and also maintain efficiencies, gain efficiencies through the strategic use of the salary savings when we have that opportunity. And we unfortunately had to delay hiring in 2 positions, and we've really been, I think, we've been triaging, we've been operating at a deficit, which we had identified pre-COVID, and we had planned and been working with HR and OFS to be able to use that salary savings to build new positions that would help us to create personnel efficiencies within the office. So we weren't looking, every time we have a vacancy, we don't just say, hey, we're going to replace this one-to-one. We look at, where's our work need? How are we staffing? How are we using, our staff, our non-attorney staff versus attorney staff effectively? Where are those needs and how can we meet them effectively? And really trying to do that within our budget. And so we've been able to contain within that, but it's also brought us to a triage space where we're taking on more work and not able to staff to the level that we need. And I know that's really the case for a lot of the departments. So we're not unique in that way. We did move the PED attorneys, and we're also doing no travel, which most people are doing, but that cut down a little bit for us as well. Next slide. So this is a listing of just a few of our grants. I'll run quickly through them. The Crime Victim Services grant we've had for several years. It does end in 2021, and we will attempt to reapply for that grant, but it isn't obviously guaranteed. And this is a really important grant for us because it pays for part of our victim witness staff, for an assistant and a coordinator, and for services and different supply needs for that program. And that program is a really critical program in the office. And so in addition to reapplying for that grant, and in 2021, we will also be looking at ways to be able to shift if we don't receive that grant. We also received the Burn JAG assistance grant through the Bureau of Criminal Justice Assistance, which is essentially DOJ to state funded, and that is wholly for Ethos. And we had that parsed out to about $50,000 each year through 2021. And that has been the majority of the money that we've been able to use for that program. Next slide. We were also able to work with the University of Minnesota to have a law student, what they call a law student resident within the office. We start them on third year, and then we keep them on for a year following. So this year we have a 3L, a third year law student in the office working 32 hours a week. Obviously, they're also working remotely at this time, but that is a value of a little close to $45,000 for the city for this year. And Edmundo has also been doing a tremendous amount of work specifically around COVID-related issues in the immigrant and refugee community, and Welcoming America is one of those that he's been working on. And this organization works towards inclusiveness and bringing together a thought community on, like-minded cities that want to offer and trade ideas on tools and resources and assistance. And we did receive a scholarship from them towards the work we're doing there and the membership that the cost of the membership that we would normally pay as a city. Next slide. New American Economy is another thought group that Edmundo is involved in, and that has assisted us with interfacing with our immigrant and refugee communities, specifically around rapid response and COVID-19. Next slide. I already mentioned these two vacancies, so I'll move on to the next slide. So Ethos is not new, but we started citywide basically right before COVID. We moved from the pilot phase into the citywide phase and then kind of stopped cold on being able to run the circles. And we've been working with Dispute Resolution Center. They have also gotten a new executive director lately. So we're coming on board with her and some changes to that organization. In addition, we're looking at ways to expand the criteria for acceptance, as well as bring that citywide. So we've been collecting data. We don't have anything statistically significant at this point, but we are looking at the types and numbers of cases, our programming requirements, participant numbers, evaluations, and tracking recidivism. So as the program continues to expand and we move forward, we will be briefing you on trends and statistics regarding the success of the program. Next slide.
Right. Before we move on, Ms. Naker has a question.
Thank you, Council President. Ms. Olson, I appreciate hearing about this. I've been curious to hear how Ethos has been going since this was kind of the major new flagship program of the department last year, starting this year, or starting last fall. So I know that the goal last year was to serve 200 participants, and obviously COVID has put a dent in that plan, but can you just give us the brief picture how many folks you've served? And also, how do we, as council members, engage in the program? There are a number of folks in my community who have talked about how they would, like to be part of restorative justice more, especially as we're seeing the increase in violent activity. And I know that the program doesn't necessarily deal with violent offenders, but how can we loop into this a little bit more?
Thank you, Councilmember Naker. Great questions. So we have, at this point, we've had 21 cases that have gone through the entire process and then been expunged. And I'd want to point out, too, that the expungement of cases on the back end is also significant. It's the first of its kind. When we approached the chief judge in the district and said, hey, we'd like to incorporate these prosecutor-led expungements into this process. That was really the first time that the district had examined doing that and how to do the process. And so we've been successful in working through those issues and getting that working. And we're awaiting rulings on another 11. So over the course of the next few months, and now that we're working through cases again, we should see that number bump up to around 32. And then we have started circles again. And so we had, I think, about another 40 in waiting that to get into circles. And and those are people that we had offered to, not necessarily that had been signed up for specific circles. So in running the pilot, we weren't looking at being able to run 200 cases through right away, but more that was our goal as far as being able to look at how the program would look once we were able to expand it. So we're expanding incrementally, and COVID has definitely slowed us down in a number of ways, not just the challenges around the circles and social distancing and how we're running those things, but as you're probably aware, there's a huge backlog of cases within the district that we're working through, and we're at about 2,600 right now that we're working through that haven't even been scheduled, in addition to cases that we're taking in, every day ongoing. So as we continue to work through those, we're really trying to focus on looking at what's appropriate for Ethos and how we can expand it. But then we're running up against the cost criteria that we have with DRC. So we brought in the paralegal. We hired the paralegal that was allocated for in the supplemental public safety budget. And we've been in the process of moving that pieces of the administration in-house and trying to cut down on the per case cost that we're currently paying with DRC. But that has also been another limitation on the amount of cases that we can take in to the program. As far as people being involved in it, we love to hear that. I think we've got information on our website, and I'd be happy to forward you the information on how to get people involved. DRC is still running our trainings, so we're taking names, and anytime you run into someone who's interested in being involved, we're happy to take their name, put it on the list, send them the information on the next trainings that are available, and get people going in the program. We really want this to be a neighborhood-based program. So have people involved where these cases are happening so that it's really a community-based process and conversation. So I appreciate knowing that, and I'm happy to work with you more closely on, how we can make sure that people who have interest are getting connected with the right information.
Thank you.
The other program that I want to highlight that isn't new. I mean, Edmundo's been here for a little over a year now, but the Welcome St. Paul Immigrant and Refugee Program that he has been building also, has taken a backseat in some ways due to just COVID challenges, but he has continued to be extremely busy making, connections in the community. He's been on radio shows and really been connecting in with people throughout the cities. And we did move forward with our VERA contract, as you know, with VERA and Ramsey County to provide services, and that did get initiated kind of despite the COVID challenges around that. So there is money still available actually for removal defense services, and we have that cadre of legal providers that is running under that contract with VERA through March of 2021. And we, go ahead. And we, in addition, Edmundo has been working. We secured the release of an ICE detainee. This was back in, I believe it was in March or April, and several of our elected leaders went to bat for this individual. His son was sick and in the hospital and needed a transplant, and they had actually removed him. And we were successful in working with our congressional delegation and the mayor's office to keep him in the country and keep him with his family. And so we're really, in addition to these, large-scale efforts to work within the community, we're really focusing on individuals and issues and cases that come to our attention where we can be of assistance to people in our community who come to our attention. Edmundo also continues to work with the prosecutors very closely on any crimmigration issues that come up in our prosecutions. Next slide. I've already spoken about Welcome America and the New American Economy, so we'll skip that. Oh, can you go back one slide? Sorry about that. Thanks. I just want to mention the Citizenship Stimulus Initiative. We had briefed you about that, I believe, last time I came in front of you. We talked about plans to build a naturalization loan, low cost, no cost loan program that would support those in our community to naturalize. And we had put out an RFP and begun to discuss with banks and other financial institutions in our community about the possibility of doing that and how to build the program. And that is another thing that got put on hold that we're reinvigorating at this point to move forward and begin that program. Next slide. Here's our 2021 overview. Again, 93% of our budget goes to salary, and we have 61.665, and that's the difference between the general fund and special fund folks, the 6.5 and the 4.5 that you see, or it would be 6.5 and 3.5. So the 60.65 we wanted to break out for that ethos that's paid. And then the services grant that goes to Ethos. So we're paying Ethos basically entirely by grant funded requirements. We don't have a line item for the program, so it remains largely unfunded, which is a big barrier to us expanding in the ways that we would want to within the time frame that we would want to. You can see the breakout between our general service funds, FTEs, and our central service fund FTEs. The remainder of our money goes to materials and other spending associated with those FTEs and those accounts. And our VOCA grant is also broken out separately here to denote the program for crime victim services. Next slide. In terms of stabilizing our budget, I talked a little bit about that previously. Our major way of doing that is through strategic hiring and looking at how we can best meet our needs based on what we project and what we're seeing in current legal services. And that goes to not only our priorities within the office, but also to the fact that most of our budget is in people. And so affecting stabilization and affecting the budget also inherently comes from that same place. Next slide. So as I spoke about a little bit before, we right-sizing the department and the work that we're seeing right now within each division really made prioritizing keeping our folks the highest priority of our funding challenges. So our reduction targets, we really look to any other way that we could meet those targets and keep our folks here, avoid layoffs and associated reduction in services that we're providing throughout the city. Next slide. We've maintained our staffing level and services for the most part. I think we've really had to our work has shifted because of COVID, but we've also, I think, really stepped up to meet new challenges that we've seen both in types of legal work as well as the amount of legal work. We continue to look at hiring entry-level attorneys to replace those that are retiring. And we really also wanted to place an emphasis on maintaining our immigrant and refugee services work, as well as the Ethos program, and figure out ways to press forward, even if it's not at the level that we had wanted it to be, because those things are priorities that go to the values of the city, that go to the values of the office, and are 2 new priority programs that we wanted to make sure that we kept an emphasis on. Next slide.
Ms. Olson, before you move on, I have a quick question. So I'm sorry, do I have an echo to you too, or is it just in my computer?
I didn't hear one.
Okay.
I didn't hear one. Councilwoman.
Okay. Actually, I'll hold my question.
Okay. Next slide. So I've already, I don't want to be redundant here, but we've already talked about the movement of these folks. The FTE changes are basically holding on vacant positions, and in addition, not receiving new positions that we had attempted to set aside money for, as well as shifting those attorneys from the general fund to the special fund. Next slide. This just basically discusses our budget concern that I've already addressed on our staffing shortages and the level of work that we're seeing come in with the emergencies that we've seen. Next slide. Next slide. So we're continuing to work grant opportunities in order to begin to recover. That's one of our best ways to try to offset the budget challenges that we have and effectively manage any upcoming vacancies that exist to maximize our staffing, knowing that we probably won't be able to right size for a couple more years. We also have really focused on flexibility with our employees through these changes. Remote work has been working pretty well for the most part. I know we're all working through that challenge, and there are pluses and minuses to all of that. But I think that our staff has and our management team has really pulled together to work with people individually on their situations and keep a focus on wellness and different ways to connect with each other while we're remote. And encourage people to have work-life balance, to take vacation, even though they're working a lot of hours, to also focus on that time with their families and to get recharged. Next slide. The biggest trade-off that we made specifically for 2021 was, again, that salary savings that we had incurred. So the salary savings that we saw that we had available, and we were anticipating that, and so an ongoing salary savings dipped into 2020 and also into 2021. And so we, again, we're giving that up for the budget savings that we needed to implement. So that those dollars will not go to the hiring that we had anticipated. We also had been anticipating being able to use overages for Ethos support, so to work with OFS to get those dollars shifted if we had overages in the program to allow us to take in more cases, and that just hasn't been something that we've been able to do, unfortunately. Next slide. So our general budget priorities, the way that we view our work.
Ms. Olson, could I just get you to pause 1 second? I'm sorry. Ms. Naker has a question.
Yes.
Thank you, Council President. Ms. Olson, how much is Ethos underfunded by?
Well, thank you, Councilmember Naker. We don't actually have a line item for that program at all. And so from its inception, we've been shifting money that's otherwise been allocated. When we first started the contract with Dispute Resolution Center, we told them we had to structure a contract that didn't have a dollar amount attached to it because we couldn't guarantee how much we'd be able to spend on the program because we had no money allocated. And so we then got the Burn JAG grant So we knew we would have $50,000 that would be allocated, and we then said, okay, we'll push that to the absolute limit that we can. And we've been able to have a pretty flexible relationship with them in terms of saying, if we had projected salary savings, that we would be able to put that towards additional cases going into that program. So at the beginning of a year, we wouldn't know, what projected savings we might be able to have then shift. But once we were aware of those savings during the year, we would be able to allocate some of that money to go towards funding that program. That's the way we've been able to do it without a line item.
Thanks. I appreciate that, but it sounds like that's not working to fund the program at the levels that it needs to be, if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly. So maybe the question is not what the line item is, if there isn't one, but just what's the dollar amount that would allow the contract with DRC to be at the point where we could serve, the 200 folks that you had set as a goal, or whatever the number is that the department thinks is, ambitious but reachable.
Sure. So right now, we've brought the per case cost with DRC down to $800 a case from $1,000, and that's for basically soup to nuts on the case. And we anticipate that will shift downwards a little bit more, but that's what we're working with right now. If we have a stretch goal for what we'd like to run through the program as 300 cases, and that brings us to $240,000 that would fully fund the current per case amount and the amount of cases that we would like to shift and be able to run through the program.
And just one final follow-up, sorry, with Council President's permission. So $240,000 would get the program to its full capacity, and we could contract for that with DRC, assumedly now, for a year ahead of service. Is that right?
Yes, Councilmember, that's correct.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So to wrap up, our goals as far as our values and the priority programs that we are supporting haven't changed. We're continuing to work with our staff to stave off burnout and to ask them to give a little more during this time, as I know we're all doing, and be able to commit to continuing to give the services throughout the city. I appreciate your time today and the opportunity to talk with you about our budget.
Thank you, Ms. Olson. Are there questions? All right. I'm having little windows popping up all over my computer. Okay, well, it doesn't, there was a few questions along the way, but it looks like we have followed along, and as often is the case, we may have follow-up after we've had a chance to digest this, but I appreciate the thorough presentation and the information that you provided us here today. So given that there are no hands up, it looks like we don't have questions for you. So I just want to thank you and your team for your work. I know these budget presentations are time consuming and kind of stress making. So we do appreciate the efforts there, and thank your team for their work this challenging year. So thank you, Ms. Olson.
President, thank you, council members. Appreciate your time today.
Colleagues, it is 11:40, and we have no other items on our agenda today unless there's something else that we should hear before we move on. All right, seeing none, we meet at HRA at 2 and City Council at 3:30. We'll see you later. We are adjourned.